Hello and welcome back to the Author Roundup, a special segment of the Book Connection Show where we meet up and coming indie authors and talk to them about the recently released books. Welcome back. This is Ray Walters. You ever notice how people can binge a whole season of a show, scroll for hours, and absorb endless opinions, yet still feel strangely hollow when the noise finally stops? Today's guest believes one of the most overlooked paths back to clarity isn't a trend, a platform, or a self-help formula. It's a story well told, not as escapism, but as a mirror. The kind of writing that quietly exposes what we love, what we fear, what we worship, what we excuse, and what we're actually becoming. In this conversation, we are stepping into a book that treats classic literature like a series of guided soul checks, stories that can be relevant, deeply personal, and even transformative, especially for readers who are worn out on religious hype but still hungry for truth, meaning, and a faith that can stand up to honest questions. Our guest has spent decades in the classroom and lecture hall watching what happens when students stop reading to get the right answer and start reading to really see and to really think. And that's what this book invites all of us to do. Welcome to the Author Roundup Show, and welcome to the author of Finding Your Faith in Literature, Dr. Karen E.B. Elliott. Dr. Elliott, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think it means a lot to me.
Congratulations on getting this book out, Doctor.
Thank you. It's been really fun. It's been a really wonderful journey.
Tell us a little bit about the nicest feedback you've received since this book came out.
Honestly, when the book went live, and I posted that on Facebook and Instagram, I heard from so many former students from 30 years of teaching.
Oh,
And then all the personal notes just of encouragement and just thanking me and memories of our class together, books that they remembered that we talked about. Um,
mhm.
that's been the best. And then I had a parent who ordered like 4 copies and let me know.
When did this book come out?
Out right before Christmas of 2025.
Oh, all right, all right. So it's just been recently published. Now, I know I've already given both our viewers and listeners a little background of what we're going to talk about, what this book is about. It is a nonfiction blend of literary reflection, classroom stories, and faith-minded commentary from a veteran literature professor. Let me jump in on the first question that I've been wanting to ask you, Dr. Elliott. What was the spark that made you want to explore faith through literature instead of writing a more traditional faith book?
Honestly, I think it was probably my relationships with some friends and family and my own faith journey. I am a woman of faith, but like a lot of people, it's ups and downs, and you're raised in a family culture or
Mhm.
a culture of faith that doesn't always resonate.
Mm.
Um, so the older I got and the more seeking I did, I just kept leaning back to stories. And my prologue, not yeah, my prologue talks about that sort of how
Yes, yes,
to cherish literature. I mean, the Bible itself is literature. It is highly respected by academics.
yes.
It was of no surprise or shock to me, but I've always been the type of person where literature has always resonated with me. And I do find that it's a good talking point because it is personal. I have so many family members and friends who have been burned by the church, or maybe they're faithful churchgoers. So I wanted to write a book that could create a dialogue that could bring anyone to the conversation table. And I do feel that good stories do that. Whether it's
True,
you me about your personal story about something that
true,
happened to you,
true.
We speak in stories and chapters in our lives all the time.
True. And on the religious side of things, I would have to agree that it's not really the Bible that destroyed some people's faith whenever they come to church, but it's the experience they had from the people of religion. And I would have to agree. I mean, people who has a strong faith in God must also reflect that outwardly. Sometimes and I've experienced this too. Um, we call out people for whatever it is that they're doing that we think is bad, that we believe is bad morally, but we're doing it in such a way that we lack compassion, like as if we're not sinners too, right? Um, Dr. Elliott, I would love to hear your working definition because that framework feels like the backbone of how you guide readers through the chapters. Your book frames certain stories as relevant, personal, and transformative. What do these three words mean to you in practice?
Well, the relevant piece is interesting because being an academic and a scholar and a researcher, and this comes up in the world of education or other circles, whether it's family or friends, casual conversation, that what's relevant now? Like, what is
Mm,
that? And I do hesitate in conversation, particularly with educators, where it's like, well, this book is old, it doesn't really resonate. And I feel like sometimes we fail to look at the relevancy of the past
yeah.
too much in the present. And I think that whether proud of something that happened in history or not, I think that this notion of just forgetting about it or not talking about it,
Mm,
even offending people, I don't know if that's always a good idea, but I also don't think
mm,
that a lot of people know how to come to those conversations. And so I deliberately chose a few texts that, just because they're old doesn't mean they're not relevant.
mhm,
There are, it's like your grandparents, like just because my grandpa was old, I mean, he was really relevant in my life. And I think that we sometimes look at things like consumers. If it's not new and it's not shiny, it can't be relevant, but we're missing a depth in culture because we do that. So I just wanted to choose a couple books that I felt would be good starters for people who
mhm.
just wanted to see like how is this book really relevant now, like where we are.
Yeah.
Personal, I think all books are personal. I think they are. Um, it's culture is always changing, but there is something about the human condition. Like we're looking for something bigger than ourselves.
Mhm.
I feel like all stories are personal, and even Christ himself, when he wanted to explain something to his disciples or just people who were listening in his presence, he always told a story,
Yes.
always. And I think that it, if God himself, gives us this text with stories and accounts of history, it matters. It says something about the human condition and our search for who we are and what our purpose is. And so I think
True.
books are personal. The way you read The Great Gatsby is going to be a little bit different than the way I read it, depending on where you and
Yeah.
I. But
True. Agree.
it's personal. And then transformative. I do think that if we allow ourselves, if we bring ourselves into the acknowledgement that this text is relevant in culture, it's it's personal to me, and it can transform me. It can make me rethink something about myself, about culture, because good books do that. Good stories, good sermons, good political talks, good
Mm,
pod, they challenge the current narrative in some way that is convicting. And sometimes conviction is uncomfortable,
true.
but vulnerable. We want to be transformed. We don't want to settle for who we were yesterday or 10 minutes ago.
True. True. Agree. Doctor, your approach is clearly not just academic. That's what I felt when I was reading your book. To me, you were aiming for real reflection. So I want to know where you most hope that reflection begins. So when a reader picks up this book, what do you hope changes first? How they read stories, how they see themselves, or how they think about God?
All of it. I mean, yes. A little. So I would say probably, let me break that down. The book was a dance to write.
Okay.
I didn't want to write something so academic that it couldn't be, that someone who isn't schooled couldn't connect to it. Do you know what I mean? And I wanted it to reach a person who is maybe strong in their faith,
Mm,
or faith at all. I also felt that it was important to personalize. I feel that self-deprecation can win respect. And honestly, the way that I write these chapters is the way that I teach my students.
mm,
I feel like I have to be vulnerable for them. I mean, I don't share everything.
yeah.
I would say that I just want to try to bridge all of it because I feel like the way our culture is now, particularly in the world of education, and I feel like honestly, anywhere in our technocratic society, is that
Mm,
we really believe that we've been trained to compartmentalize everything. And that includes our relationships. Like even the way the educational system is designed, like you go from math to this subject or to this subject, and your brain requires like 20 minutes to adjust to where it is. Whereas the Renaissance experience was more holistic, you had theology at the center, and there was this
mm,
that everything came out of that. Um, and so I feel like what I want people to see is that I don't want people to compartmentalize their feelings or their desires or their questions, but just bring it all together, that our relationships and our experiences and everything that we are and what we seek, we're all interconnected in some way. And so I guess that was really the tricky goal, was to take personal anecdotes in a way that I'm talking about myself a lot of the time. Like I talk about
mm.
some, but I also talk about what happens in my classroom, and that's dangerous too because I need to be as anonymous for them as possible. But then also, how do I bring in the academic side without imposing my own feelings and world views? Because I
Mm,
believe in the historicity of a text. Like you have to look at the text from an authorial and historical standpoint. I
true, true.
feel like that when we do that, we can bring it all together. So how we read stories, how we see ourselves, I think that it inevitably will help us to transcend beyond that. I don't know if I did a good job answering your question, but it's like I want us to take the things that we compartmentalize and bring them together. For example, let me explain compartmentalization. So
Okay.
it's like you, as a student, you know, you cheat in this class, but you don't cheat in this class. So over here you cheated, over here somehow you're a better person, but really your integrity has been compromised either way. Does that make
Yes.
like
Yes.
if falling apart because a spouse is flirting with someone who they've known for years online, nothing's really happened yet, but they can compartmentalize that and still be the faithful spouse at home, but integrity has still been compromised. And I
Gotcha.
think we do that all the time. And so part of my goal was to just kind of say books are personal and they require us to, we're all in. Like if you
Mm,
actually have a book and nothing else around you, you cannot help but transcend into some way. And so my hope is that my readers will find a joy for reading again, like real books. I feel like it makes us better people. My students tell me that. Um,
mm,
because in my classroom or lecture hall, they're not allowed to have any technology. Even before
mm,
there's nothing. Phones have to go in a bucket. No,
mm.
I order out of my own pocket sometimes. We all have the same book, so we're literally on the same page, and we sit and we discuss. We read closely. We talk about history, and I facilitate good conversation. And through that, my students have told me that some of them have, who have their pinky toe in faith, they've been able to step in a little bit more. That are students that have questioned their faith and want to walk away, they're able to come back. And it's really through the secular books that I teach that have done this. Um, so that's kind of a big roundabout answer, but I guess it's I want everyone to have all those things when they walk away from the book, and maybe even read some of the books that they didn't read in high school or college.
Right, right. It's a very good answer. And speaking of um, classroom experience, um, this book grows out of lived classroom experience. So I wanted to ask you this question because I'd like listeners to hear what patterns you've witnessed over time. Now, you've taught for decades. Um, what have students taught you about the obstacles people face when it comes to faith, truth, and meaning? I know you've touched a little bit on this, but can we explore further?
Well, I'll look at the first part of the question you asked me regarding the obstacles that we
Mm,
face when it comes to our faith, truth, and what's the meaning of my life. I would say the main obstacle that has been so consistent is most of the time, and this is students in my classroom or when I go out into the world and I'm interacting with other academics, whether it's in America or overseas, whatever,
mm,
people don't have a problem with God usually, and they don't have a problem with Jesus. They have a problem with Christians. And like you said previously, it's we don't often model who we claim to follow.
yeah.
And And I think that that's always been the consistent obstacle and stumbling block for, honestly, I think for most people wherever they stand.
Hmm.
Um, and that is one of the reasons why I passionately teach the way I teach, because I'm trying to show my students other ways to look at things. I have had students in the past who didn't know why they were Catholic. They didn't know why they were Protestant. They didn't know about
Mm,
the like, and they're getting really on paper, they have really great grades, but they've never really looked deeply at a lot of the things that they're reading and thinking about. And I think that if we have this device, which I don't think it's an evil thing per se, but if we're just going,
yeah.
and we're not really reflecting. And so I feel like the obstacle, honestly, has always been the church itself or followers of the church. There are some really good churches and some really good people out there who are trying really
True.
hard. Um, But like you had mentioned before, the hypocrisy gets in the way. And the second part of your question is the patterns that I've witnessed over time that have been so beautiful and consistent, which honestly was one of the many reasons why I wanted to write this book, was it doesn't matter if it was 30 years ago or like today when I was teaching my courses, that the students value the space to read and think. They don't feel like they have the space to read and think and reflect without distraction. So like even if you're reading like the news online or I look something up and I'll read something, it's so easy to get a notification or you're always interrupted. And so in my space, it's quiet. The way that I even my environment, the way I've designed the furniture and the setup. So like we have desks in the room, but then the space where we go to talk about the heavy stuff of literature and life, I have this space carved out with different chairs. Kids can sit on the floor. We turn the lights off. We have lamps. There's tea brewing, and and the students look at this as a sacred space
Yeah.
that we
A
have
safe
really
space.
free, safe space.
Mm,
And because I'm vulnerable sometimes, I mean, I don't think it's professional to share everything about myself with my
true,
students.
true.
However, I think that I'm willing to be vulnerable with them, and then it helps to foster that safe space so that honestly, they're just open. Because sometimes not all students want to talk,
Yes,
but you can tell when someone's engaged in conversation, even if they're just um, an active listener.
true. Creating safe spaces like that allows the students to understand the whiffins. So I call it whiffins. What's in it for me? If I engage in a certain discussion, discussing a certain topic, will I be ridiculed for having that kind of perspective, or while they may not agree, I'd still get that feeling that I was heard, that they were listening. And we can agree to disagree sometimes, or most of the time, or often, but that safe space um, does not necessarily invalidate you or your thoughts or how you see things. It might give you a different perspective on how you should be seeing things based on the lenses of others. But again, that safe space is crucial. When you invite people in for discussions like that, um, you can be vulnerable, but at the same time, you are in control of that. You're in control of what you're going to say, and be able to also interact and exchange ideas. That's very beautiful, Dr. Elliott. Um, how do you help students move from hot takes to careful reading, especially in a world shaped by distraction and speed? Because you've said earlier, and I do agree with that. Even when you're on your laptop and like in my case, I'm working, I respond to my boss about certain things, and then there's a notification that comes up. It just flashes. It's a tiny bar right on top of my screen, but it's enough for me to cut what I'm doing and and just and veer away and swerve away.
Well, I'll start with, I think, in something that I'm thinking about talking more. Anyway, I'm creating a website where a platform I want to create is to how to mentor upcoming teachers and encourage educators, because I feel like the first thing that I have to do and be as a facilitator in discussions such as this is I need to be as smart as I can. I have
Mm,
to be reading and researching as much as I can, because the students are going to ask me hard questions. And going back
right.
to the space, when they're in a safe space, they're going to ask hard and challenging questions because they have a right to do that. They do. And I want to be able to provide those answers. And if I don't know that, I will have the humility to be like, okay, I'll get back to you on that. But
Yeah.
to be, if you, unless you have someone who can facilitate a discussion, because I've read a lot and I've studied a lot. If you just are sort of familiar with an idea, then what I've seen what happen with educators is there's no hot takes. There's no careful reading, because it's
Mm,
all feel about this. Well, I mean, I always tell my students, it's not that I don't care about how you feel. I want to know what you know, um, because there's a lot of feelings going out right now. And the problem is that people have a lot of very strong opinions about things they don't really know much
mm,
about.
mm,
Um, and I think that's dangerous. And so the hot takes is you put to careful reading. First of all, as I said before, the space I create is basically technology free. And so we
mm,
have physical books, they take notes. I create notes or guidelines where I'll have like a series of questions. So like they'll come in the room and I try to be random. So they have to interact with different types of kids. Sometimes kids they don't
mm,
be friends with, or they just don't know. And then they all have to work together and I give them a very specific prompt. They can't answer any question without textual evidence. And so then we go to the carpet, or they call it the discussion group.
mm,
Everyone has to say something. I'm like, everybody's voice matters, even if you just read a quotation, right? And so they initiate their takeaways from this deep analysis, and then I'll take it even further. Like, oh, Ray, you brought up this really great idea about Gatsby and the American Dream, and then I'm going to deepen that, and we're going to take it further. And so I would say that deep reading and deep thinking will take us to the spiritual and the moral sides of things. But it's all about the space that we create for ourselves, and it requires so much discipline now. Like you
mm,
literally have someone standing in front of the room with a bucket. The students make fun of me because they call it the bucket of moral integrity. And I'm like, okay, who needs integrity? The phones. They all just start throwing keys, watches, and they put it in this bucket because they need to actually have someone say, I'm going to take this, I'm going to give it back to you at some point, but you are not allowed to even see this thing. And so I think the deep dive into literature requires the space you give yourself to do it, even if you or I are just reading a book by ourselves, giving us
Are
permission to put this away
are
and go on.
okay. Doctor, I'd love to surface your selection filter because your chapters show you're not picking texts at random. You're picking them for what they expose in us. When you choose a book to teach, what are you looking for beneath the plot? What qualities make a story worth wrestling with?
Um, well, like in the book that I wrote, I'm very careful to make sure that students will feel the relevancy of a book. So, for example, I try to get to know my students anyway, but I'm thinking, what was I thinking about when I was 18 or 19 or 23? I also try to look at what's happening in culture, like what's going on right now. So, for example, we just in one of my courses, it's a freshman composition course, and then another course I teach. We just worked through Othello, and we did a real deep dive into it. I teach at a prep school right now, in addition to my other things that I do for colleges, but my primary work is at a prep school that's mostly white. And so we have few students of color. And so I thought, okay, Shakespeare's really relevant. Let's read Othello like we're all teenagers, and he's the one Black student on the team. And so we went for it, and it was so interesting because helping students to understand, what was happening during Shakespeare's time. The slave trade was at its height, right? What did it look like to be a Moor? What part of Africa was Othello from? What does this mean for Venice? And so we would have these incredible discussions. And I had this one student, he was on our football team, and at the end of class, they're all just kind of chewing on it. And the student raised his hand and he said, I just never realized that Shakespeare is so relevant, and I get what he's saying. And then it's always so interesting because they always complain at the beginning, this is so hard to read. And I'm like, okay. But then by the end, they say the reading's just getting easier. And I said, it's not that the reading's getting easier. Shakespeare doesn't change the way he's writing. It's that your brain is working out. It's like,
Yeah.
and the words, they're not distancing themselves from the words. They're just letting it come in. And I've seen that with so many things like Beowulf, which is the oldest text we have in this language, but he was 18 years old when the story begins. Or, just I'm always looking for things that what are these students going through, and why have some of these books stood the test of time? Because Shakespeare wasn't the only one writing when he wrote his plays. Like
Yeah.
there were
Yeah.
writers that were relevant for their time. But there is something to be said for writers that seem to transcend all this. And so to help our students see that, I just try to pick things that I think honestly they could identify with. And I work really hard to try to help them see it too, without
Mhm.
the integrity of the text. So that's kind of what I do. I read a lot. I almost never teach the same thing twice. Sometimes I do.
Well, I I agree. Well, not all of the subjects I had in college were my favorite, but some were like sort of like acquired taste. And I agree with you on that. It doesn't really become easy because whatever the content of the book that you're reading does not really change. The change actually happens within me. I become more engaged, engrossed with the topic. The facilitator is doing a really good job in bringing that one out, in answering again my what's in it for me whenever I do something or whenever I'm asked to do something. Um, it's nice. It's stepping back into those days when I also had that kind of role when it's like, okay, why are we talking about this? Can we use this in real life? Uh, Literature is it's fun. It may not necessarily mean that you can use it in real life, just like applied mathematics, but there are certain concepts it teaches you. gives you the clarity that you need on some things that you need to get clarified on. Um, a doctor, a theme running through your work is self-reflection. What are a few mirror moments you hope readers experience while reading your chapters?
To further something you just said, I think that when we read books, if it can make us more compassionate people, better listeners. Um, I think no matter what you do in your life, like for example, my friend, I have a friend from Boston who is one of the highest achieving wonderful doctors at Mass General. But before she went to med school, she was an English literature major. And she has often said how much she was so grateful that she did that because reading all those books and delving in to those spaces helped her be a better doctor and more compassionate and helped her to see different points of view or just to have patience. Books make us step back and make us pause. And so I guess for me, the mirror moments that I hope readers experience would be humility. um, we can't change ourselves. We can't hope to make an impact on our own spaces or society without humility. Without humility, we can't have real dialogue.
Mm,
And I think we have too many examples of a lack of humility and dialogue um, today in our culture. I think that although social media platforms, some of them can be really great, like this one. You're doing good things with a platform that can reach so many people. Um, However, I think that with so many, so many distractions, I think that it doesn't hone our humility. We can't really think about others when I'm always getting a notification about what's in my Amazon save for later cart. I think we need to give ourselves space to contemplate, think about what we're doing. We're rushing from thing to thing, even if we're just sitting down at our desks. Our brains, we've been fooled to think that we can multitask and do all of these things well, but I don't know if that's really possible. So I would say a mirror moment would be humility. Like when I walk away from reading something, does it make me more compassionate? Is it offering me the invitation to be more noble?
mm.
And you have to be a great person to be noble. I think that you can be noble anywhere you go. And I actually just said this to my students the other day. I say, make whatever space you're in better than when you entered it. Even if you're going into the supermarket, how can you make that space better? Just by an interaction you have with the cashier.
Yeah,
Getting us outside of ourselves and thinking about how others are feeling and that they have stories, some stories that are really hard. And that might be the reason why the cashier treated me in a rude way, but it wasn't had nothing to do with me. That's when I need the humility. It could have been her own circumstances.
true. So true. Now, this next question, when I framed this, I thought this balance is hard. So, what I would like to know by asking you this is I'd like you to explain how you honor what's true and beautiful in a text without letting the text become the final authority. So, how do you hold two commitments together, appreciating literary excellence on the one hand and not excusing moral confusion on the other?
I think this question is very compelling because I don't think that we should divorce the text's authority to what is beautiful and true. I think part of what's happened in our culture of reading, and I see this even with other educators, is this notion to impose my feelings and my personal beliefs onto a text. And when we do that, we actually we dishonor the authority of the text and there's no way that we can really make the bridge into what the author was trying to say. For example, I'll use the Bible as an example, where we know over time that people have taken certain verses out of context because it's convenient. You know,
Yes.
because if I stop there, then I can use it as a club. When we've
Yeah.
taken context, I mean, I have students who have very strong convictions about the Bible, but they don't know who wrote a book in the epistles. You know, they don't really know. And so I think like going back, we have a lot of very strong opinions about things we don't know a lot about. And I think what my one of my jobs is that, you know, the text is the final authority in the sense that what the author meant to say, what was happening in their lifetime or with them personally dictated what they wanted to say. And so when we can take that and look at that closely, it helps us to understand what was going on with a character or what was going on with a particular event. And then when we see it for what it really was, we're able to embrace that. For example, when I write in chapter 6, I talk about the play A Doll's House and how we really misinterpret scripture when it comes to roles of men and women. And, you know, wives submit to your husbands. If we just stop there, we don't know what was going on in that century. We don't know why St. Paul was writing this letter and what were his real motives. Who was he addressing? Who was his audience? You know, what he said after that. I mean, I'm always like, wait a second, guys. It says husbands are supposed to love their wives as Christ loved the church and sacrificed himself, you know, for her. And so then, you know, let's really unpack this because we can't just take a snippet of something and say, this is true, this is what it means. I think that that is a dangerous thing to do. And so when you asked that question, my first reaction was, but the text does have the final authority. Do you know what I mean? But it's how we read it. And that if we can accept what was happening, the historicity of the text, then we're able to honor what is true and beautiful about this book and what this author was trying to give us this gift. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And thank you for making me think about it. For I forgot my stand. Uh, I've always believed on the five solas
Mm.
and sola scriptura. Um, in the scripture is the final authority. Um, when you were taught, and I'd have to take a step back because I would want to go ahead and ask that question from the perspective of someone who lacks the contextualization of scripture. Um, uh, in 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 theology, uh, in biblical exposition, you have to fully understand first who were the audience, what were the customs in those days that the Bible allowed. You know, especially in the time before the New Testament came in, before Christ was incarnated into this world, there was a practice of taking in several wives in how the scripture viewed that and how Christ redefined it. Um, when he came, when he introduced the new covenant. And sometimes when it just made me realize actually that sometimes yeah, I tend to forget that being a Christian, uh, the final authority is the scripture. True.
But it is, and I know as a woman of faith, the only way we can really understand the authority and is to really seek and understand what it means.
True.
Do you know what I mean? And I feel like a lot of times what happens today is no one's no one's really reading. People are skimming, you know, people are picking things out. We're multitasking, and sometimes we even mean well when we're doing it, but
Yeah.
we're not looking deep enough because sometimes we don't like what we find. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yes. it actually exposes the status of our heart.
And it's like I remember Mark Twain once said, he goes, I don't have a problem with the Bible in this. I mean, what I understand, for the stuff I don't understand, I don't have a problem with it. I have a problem with the things that I read that I think I understand. And wrestling with those things. I mean, good literature creates conviction for good reason. Um, yeah, so it's kind of a big answer to a very big question.
Thank you for that, Doctor. That was an eye opener for me, um, as a Christian. My next question for you is, in your experience, what kinds of stories tend to open the best conversations with people who feel burned by religion but still hunger for meaning?
Wow, that is a really good question. Um, I would say, okay, is it okay if I respond with an anecdote?
Yes.
Um, so when a few years back, I've taken courses and things at Oxford, and I love Oxford. And one of the things I love about Oxford is that it's such an intellectual hub, and everyone is so smart that it's a bit taboo, to very quickly say you're wrong. Do you know what I mean? And I love the rich conversations you can have with people. So I was in this study group, and it was a wonderful study group. There were about 8 of us. And when I go into these situations, everyone's from all over the world. Everyone's really smart. Everyone's super interesting. And so I decided the first 2 days of my study group that I wasn't going to say anything. I was just going to read the room, take
Mm,
notes, things like that. And so I just listening. And then the topic came up a few days into the study group where there were a couple of Muslim men who were talking about the creation story. And um, and then at one point somebody made a comment and I said, well, actually, the sun comes out on the fourth day. And so I began to explain the creation story as a metaphor for like when it was written and how it was, there are Babylonian customs and what this meant. And anyway, and so the conversation kind of evolved from there into issues of science and faith and things like that. So
mhm,
we had this really great discussion. And so after that hour was over, we had a break for lunch. And I was walking out of Harris Manchester College and I was crossing the street. And this woman, this German woman, who's now a friend of mine, she ran out in the middle of the street and she said, whoa, 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 can you stop in her German accent? And I said, yeah, yeah, yeah. And she said, so you're telling me that you are a Christian and you believe in evolution? And I said, yeah. And she goes, okay, can we talk? So we went out to a pub for like 2 hours and she shared with me her life story, her background in her own faith and just her conflicting feelings regarding science and could the two be merged and everything. And so I would say an answer to that question is sometimes the best way to open a conversation is to say nothing,
mhm,
just to say hello, let people tell their stories, give people the space to reflect. And when I moved down to Atlanta, one thing I love the South, but we moved from Boston to Atlanta. And one of my favorite things is when we go on our trips, you go out into the countryside and you see these little churches and they have like these signs out front of the church and they have like these really witty sayings, and sometimes they're funny and sometimes kind of okay. But we were driving by one and I saw this one church sign and it said, love everybody, period. Let God sort us out. And I thought that was just really interesting to me because I think that there's something theologically true in that statement. I don't think that you have to understand or affirm what everybody's doing. I don't think that's what love is. I think love is unconditionally listening, being patient, kind, all the things that Paul talks about in what love is supposed to look like. And Jesus' commandment is you need to love people the way I have loved you. Um, And like I said, I don't think that means when you love someone, you have to approve of everything. I don't have to understand it, but anyone's welcome into my home. Anyone is welcome to my dinner table. Anyone. And I think sometimes that's the best way to start conversations. Um, yeah.
Was there a particular chapter or a particular classic that challenged you personally while writing your book?
You know, it's funny. At first, when I think about that question, I think, no, I love all the books. They're all great. But, but there, I remember in particular, I would probably have to say Frankenstein because there's when I start writing chapters for this book, I sort of know where they're going to go, but I sort of don't. So I feel like the reader is kind of mercilessly trapped in my consciousness, like where
Okay.
and so the chapter began to evolve into, how professors in particular treat their students, because I'm always reminding my fellow colleagues, we have so much power. We have so much power. With every point that I give or deduct is going to change someone's future.
Yeah.
I'm always telling, I'm like, you guys, this is important. And we have this power. We have this intellectual power. Like some of these kids look up to us and they hang on every word we say. And we could be wrong. And and I think sometimes there was a part in the chapter of Frankenstein where I talked about how Victor was so influenced by one of his professors who he knew in his heart was a dangerous man to listen to. But this professor just kind of fed into Victor's notions about life and who he wanted to be, even though Victor admits he knew it was wrong. And I began to think about, just how many students I've inspired, but then how many students have I hurt or made
Mm.
feel down? I mean, honestly, that is something that does keep me up at night. It always has. It's easy to remember the compliments. Surveys are weird because sometimes when kids do surveys, they say, well, I wish we didn't read as many books. Well, it's a literature course, so I can't really take that personally, but just the kids who I've only had two or three students in the past 30 years who've come back to say, when you said that, this is how it made me feel. And I'm so grateful that they came back to tell me that, and then we were able to have a really good conversation. I was like, oh, you took it that way? Because I didn't mean that at all. But yeah, that haunts me sometimes because I think any educator, it's kind of like being a parent. You have all of these students who you love and you cherish and you want the best for them. But then sometimes you say things that there's no way you could have known how it would have been taken. And yeah, it's challenging. I would say that that chapter, I had moments in that chapter where I had to sort of pause and just kind of think about who I am and what my job really is and the power that I hold and how dangerous and beautiful and awful that power can be.
Thank you so much for talking about that, Doctor. It gave me a glimpse of what runs in the mind of an educator, actually. Um, and it can't it's not just about you being an educator. Something similar could happen somewhere when you hold power.
Mhm.
Yeah, when you hold power, you could probably be a boss talking down on a subordinate, or maybe
Yeah,
just talking about something positive, or you meant it to be positive, but for whatever state of mind they're in on that very day, they take it differently.
yeah,
But the good thing about what you do is that if I get back to you and talk to you about it, it's an okay thing. I think it's not a safe space. I mean, work does not give you that safe space that much to be able to bring it without worrying about consequences later on. What do you hope a skeptical reader will not misunderstand about your intent, especially if they assume faith and serious literature don't mix?
ooh, that's a loaded question. Wow. So I would say I'll answer the first part I'll begin with that. I don't want a reader to misunderstand. I don't want people to think that I'm trying to necessarily not evangelize, but my goal is twofold. I would love people to give God a second chance because I've seen it with my students, but I don't want people to look at this book and say, "Oh, she's just preaching." And I worked really hard so that it wasn't like that because that's not kind of my style anyway. So I would say the skeptical reader, I would pray that they would not miss that they wouldn't read it because they thought, or that they thought that I had a particular political bent.
Mm,
Because I do not I think that a lot of people's theological beliefs are not theological, they're more political. And I kind of wanted to clear the air on that when I wrote the book as well. What was really interesting because one of the chapters that I wrote, I had a girlfriend come up to me and she said, "Oh, and you were preaching it on that one and about the government." And I said, "It's funny you say that because I wrote that chapter before this, I mean, I was writing about government in general. I wasn't really leaning into a particular administration. And so that there's always that like I said, books are personal. So people tend to take something and then whatever they're working through, and I can't control that. Um, but I guess I just don't want anyone to think that it's going to be preachy because I want them to open up and read it. I also think it's funny that faith and serious literature don't mix. That is such an interesting thing. I know people have said that, but I mean, the Bible is literature. I mean, I feel like I was having a discussion with my students the other day where, what's the purpose of literature? And I said, well, they were asking me from a standpoint of a woman of faith. And I said, well, Jesus is called the Word made flesh. God spoke creation into existence. Um, and he's given us the written word to sort of lean on and explore and know him better. Jesus, anytime he was trying to explain who the character of God was through stories. And so I'm thinking, I think, there's so many other ways that God could have leaned into humanity, but he chose himself and literature to reach us. And so there's something really beautiful about that faith and serious literature actually mix, but it's our culture that keeps asking us to compartmentalize our faith or who we are, whatever it is, right? But I think they do mix. And I think that's such a good conversation piece. Do they mix? Why is this relevant? Those are my favorite questions when students ask me that. Why do we have to read this? I'm like, okay, why should we? And then we have this great conversation about it.
do you ever get to ask them to why we shouldn't be reading a book?
Yes. Well, I mean, I have a friend who I love, and he's such a smart person. He's such a scholar. And he said they were visiting us a little bit ago, and he was like, I just think that all books are holy. Like that we're all made in the image of God. And I do agree with him, but there are some things that aren't good to read. And I or watch, and those are conversations that actually we're having a lot lately in the world of education because of this and algorithms. And so there are
Yeah.
things that are good to read. Otherwise, if it were true that everything was fair game, I wouldn't have written this book.
Doctor, I'm going to have to ask the closing question. Um, it's before I do and close this conversation that I'm enjoying actually, I just would want to ask you, where can our interested viewers and listeners grab a copy of your book?
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere books are sold. If they could always go up to the manager or something and ask them to, if it's not, they could order it. But
Mm.
Amazon seems to be the hot spot, and Barnes and Noble website. That's what my students and colleagues are telling me. So if you just Google my name and it'll pop up and you can get it there. Yeah. I'd be
All
so
right.
honored.
So I have a respectful challenge question. Um, if someone said stories are great, but they can't give you God, only impressions, how would you respond? Where do you draw the line between literature as a helpful guide and literature as a substitute for truth?
Mm. These are such multi-layered questions, Ray. Let's go. So I would say that stories are great, but they can't give you God, only impressions. I only impressions of God, absolutely. I would probably, if someone threw that challenging statement at me, I would agree with them in all sincerity. I would say, yeah, I mean, on the surface, um, but it can give us an impression, and that's worth exploring. What is the impression um, that we get just because God may not be mentioned directly. Like Flannery O'Connor, man, some of her stories are heavy. And but yet she often said in her personal life that God was always haunting her. So he's like behind her, haunting her, and she's writing
Mhm.
these stories. So what impressions do we get? I mean, that there's a darkness in human beings that Flannery O'Connor explores. Um, and how can those lead us to God? I mean, I think most of it probably could. Where do I draw the line between literature as a helpful guide and a substitute? I don't think that there's any substitute for truth with a capital T. Um, I think that part of the reason why I wrote this book is I think that literature is a helpful guide. But, you know, I always tell my colleagues that we're all in this together. We do teach at a school that is faith-based, and not everyone who goes there is a faithful person. Like there's a lot of people who go there because their parents make them. There's a lot of people who go there because that's just all they know. There's lots of different reasons. And so I always tell my colleagues, it doesn't matter what we're teaching. It's a medium to reach. It's like my students the other day, they had just taken a test from another class and they were all like, some people were actually crying because it was so hard. Like, I hate this. Why do I have to do this? Whatever. And I said, okay, but what we get in education, I said, your day, you have 6 different courses, 7 different courses. You have the privilege of being able to look into each course. You are getting a glimpse, just a glimpse of God's very complicated personality. And sometimes there are elements of his personality that you are not going to figure out. It's just too hard. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth exploring and appreciating the complexity of this being who is so beautiful and complicated. And I think that it's worth seeking it. And if it's not literature, I have some colleagues that are these brilliant science guys who some of the things that they create and the innovation that they have, it can only be by some higher power that they're able to do it. I certainly can't. And respectfully, they're so sweet to me because they'll say, I don't know, they'll say, they think I'm smart because I read books and I just remember what I've read, which I think is really sweet that they think I'm smart. But we're all in this together. I just, for some reason, I've been given a gift where I have this very strong memory. I'm able to make connections with history, philosophy, and literature and theology in ways that not everybody can. But I could not tell you the algebraic equation for the stained glass I see in the church that I attend and how that works. But that's what makes us all this body, the fabric. David Brooks calls it from his book, The Second Mountain. And I'm not going to do a good job at this, but I love this passage at the end when he talks about the fabric of society and how each of us, like when I tell the truth, I am making the fabric of society richer. I am mending a part of the fabric of society. If I lie to get ahead, I am corrupting the fabric of society. And so we each play a part in seeking truth and how that truth is going to play out. And we have an individual choice to rest on those impressions. Yeah, I think that God can be in anything, but we either can rest in that and lean into it, or we dismiss it. And that's certainly our human choice to do that. Not all of my students love my classes. Not all of them want to do the reading. But but I still am optimistic and I have hope because I believe that they've been put in my classroom or my lecture hall because I'm supposed to interact with this being for however long I'm supposed to interact with them, that I can somehow offer them something, some element of truth, and they in turn can teach me as well to see something different in myself so that I can grow closer.
Dr. Elliott, such a pleasure having you on the show today, really. Thank you for discussing your book with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ray. It was really nice to chat with you. Yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation. It was really great. Thank you.
Truly enjoyed it. I do talk to a lot of authors. There are a lot of topics, some of the topics I'm not familiar with, especially when it comes to science. But the learnings that I get towards the end of every conversation, it's priceless. And I'm actually, I've learned a lot talking to you. Such a pleasure talking to you, Doctor, for sharing your thoughts. We for me, while I was trying to hold back and make sure that I'm not asking questions and also give away spoilers, but I hope I was able to ask you the questions that, would make this conversation worthwhile for you.
Oh, I loved it. I don't think there were any spoilers. I hope that people are inspired to want to read the book and I am building a website now that I would love for people to reach out, finding our soul in literature and modern education and culture, something along those lines. So yeah, I love engagement. So I'm
All
very
right.
grateful. Thank you so much.
Doctor, again, thank you so much for your time. I also would want to give a big shout out to our awesome viewers and listeners for joining us for this interview. Stay tuned for more inspiring conversations on the Author Roundup. I'm Ray Walters. Join me next time as we explore the world of supported self publishing, one indie author at a time.